looking at the Vietnam War. The actual conflict that started in Vietnam is going to begin in 1955 and officially end in 1975. Looking at the overview of the Vietnam War, it was a war fought between Communist North Vietnam and the government of South Vietnam. The North was supported by communist countries, China and the Soviet Union. The South was supported by anti-communist countries, the United States of America, us. Before the war, prior to World War II, Vietnam had been a colony of the French, so France. During World War II, Japan took control of the country. And then after World War II, Vietnam was returned to the French, because remember, Japan was defeated by the United States with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So what actually began this war? Beginning of the war, the Vietnamese revolutionary and communist Ho Chi Minh wanted freedom and began fighting the French. He was actually upset that Vietnam was returned back to the French. He was hoping that Vietnam would become an independent nation, a communist nation at that. And of course, the United States didn't want that to happen because we're in the Cold War era. So that's why they returned the country back to France. However, France was not doing that well as far as defeating the Vietnamese. So they asked for help from the United States. The United States, we were going to say no. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Ho Chi Minh is going to ask help from the United States. And we're going to say no because we feared the spread of communism. So we're not going to help a communist government or leader defeat a democracy, which is France at the moment in Vietnam. So Ho Chi Minh started to win against the French. He disregarded what the United States said and said, okay, fine, if y'all are not going to help us, we're still going to go and fight the French. And they did. And he was becoming very successful. Because of that, the United States became worried because we thought that France would be able to defeat this small revolutionary, and they were not. So in 1950, the USA starts sending aid to the French. Not soldiers, but aid, like weapons, material that helped them win the war against the Vietnamese. The aid that we were sending did not help. North Vietnam was still winning. So the U.S. will enter the war. 1954, the French lost a major battle and decided to pull out of Vietnam. They loved the country divided. The North was communist and the South was democracy. So the French gave up in 1954. We had a choice. We could have left the country as it is, divided, and let them have a civil war and decide the government. But because we were in the Cold War and we want to stop communism from spreading by practicing containment, the U.S. got involved to prevent communism from spreading to the whole country. President Johnson's our war plan, he was our president during the time, he helped the South Vietnamese get strong enough to fight the North. So he said, look, we won't directly fight the North Vietnamese. What we will do is train the South Vietnamese on how to fight and teach them to defeat the North Vietnamese. That was the plan. So that puts limit on the U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. Vietnam was a very difficult war. The U.S. troops were limited in what they could do. The jungles of Vietnam were difficult to fight in. Keep in mind, we're fighting on their home turf, not ours, theirs. So because of that, it was very difficult to find the enemy or even know who the enemy was. When we would encounter a Vietnamese, we wouldn't know if they were for us or against us, which led troops had to deal with booby traps and constant ambushes from the Vietnamese because we never knew who was on our side. So a lot of Americans were dying in this war. 58,220 U.S. soldiers died in the Vietnam War. However, millions of Vietnamese died either in battle or in crossfire. We're going to use various techniques to try to win this war, and we'll talk about that more in class. But it would be times where, you know, the Vietnamese may get caught in some crossfire, and that's why they had a higher casualty than we did. With only we had over 58,000, and they had millions. So the U.S. will exit the war. We have a new president now. New President Richard Nixon decided to end U.S. involvement in the war. By this time, the American people want the United States to pull out of the war. It was during this time that there was a draft, so people were forced to fight in the Vietnam War. That's why Lyndon Johnson didn't run for president again, because he knew he wouldn't win. They were just frustrated. They just wanted to get out of Vietnam. So when Richard Nixon became president, he began removing troops in July of 1969. On January 27, 1973, a ceasefire was negotiated. By March, all U.S. troops were gone. The North Vietnamese said that they would leave the South Vietnamese alone. That was not true. In April of 1975, South Vietnam is going to surrender to North Vietnam. And then Vietnam, the whole country is going to turn into a communist nation, and it's going to become the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The U.S. had lost the Vietnam War and taken a major blow in the Cold War. So the Chinese Revolution, the country became a communist nation. The same thing is going to happen to Vietnam. So now we have the Soviet Union, China, and Vietnam are all communist nations in the Cold War. And that's it. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Vietnam War and the weapons used in class.